Welcome to the Broken System Podcast. I'm your host, Robert, and joining me is my insightful co-host, Lexi. Together, we're here to uncover the flaws and challenges within our justice system, where fairness and equality often fall short.
In this podcast, we aim to delve into the complexities of our justice system and explore the experiences and perspectives of those who have been affected by its shortcomings. We'll dive deep into the stories of individuals who have faced injustice and examine the systematic issues that perpetuate the broken system.
Our goal is to bring awareness to the disparities and biases that exist within our justice system, and to inspire our listeners to take action. Through thought-provoking discussions, interviews, and analysis, we'll explore the various aspects of the broken system and seek to understand how it can be reformed.
We believe that by shining a light on these issues, we can empower our listeners to become advocates for change. We'll discuss potential solutions, highlight success stories, and provide resources for those who want to make a difference.
So whether you're a concerned citizen, a legal professional, or simply someone who wants to learn more about the flaws in our justice system, we invite you to join us on this journey. Together, let's challenge the broken system, amplify unheard voices, and work towards a more just and equitable future.
Get ready to explore the depths of our justice system like never before. This is the Broken System Podcast.
This content is not suitable for children, as it may contain material or themes that are intended for a mature audience. Additionally, it is important to emphasize that individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in the court of law, and judgments should be reserved until a fair and impartial legal process has taken place.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on the Broken System Podcast are entirely their own and do not necessarily represent the perspectives, opinions, or positions of the hosts or contributors.
So welcome back, everyone. I'm Robert, and I'm here with Lexi. And this week we have with us Dana Pohl from TrueCrime PI. And we wanted to bring Dana on and just kind of chit-chat and talk through and just, gather some information for us and for her and just kind of have a good conversation. So welcome, everybody. Hope everybody's having a good night.
I'm having a great night. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Glad everyone's here. So I guess we'll just start from the top. How did you get involved in all of this, Dana?
So I feel like I've told this story many times, and every time I kind of tell it a little bit differently, but, and I think it's because I think about it after I've shared it, and then I'm like, maybe I should explain, back a little further. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, which would be growing up in the 1970s, 1980s, and the milk carton era. So I think about where my kind of passion for true crime has come from, or where it's grown from. And I really think it starts way back in elementary school when I would get out my cereal and milk in the morning and sit down to eat my breakfast, and staring at me were the faces of missing children. So back in the day, as many of you know, they would print the photos of missing children on milk cartons and tell a little bit about their description, where they went missing from, how they went missing, that sort of thing. And I was a big reader, and I would read the milk carton and the cereal box every day. So I think it became a reality to me, even living in a neighborhood where we would stay out till the street lights came on and past that. But it became a reality to me. So I had a lot of freedom growing up, but at the same time, I knew that we had to be careful. We had to be smart. We had to be paying attention. And so it was a heartbreaking thing as a child to read about another child who went missing, for me especially, because I just felt like, I couldn't imagine if my sister went missing, or, if my friend went missing, how I would feel, how parents would feel, how that child would be so afraid to be away from their family. So I really think that that's where the kind of passion for justice, like, that was so wrong. Why would anybody ever do that to to anyone? And so I think it grew from that. I was a big mystery lover and reader. Encyclopedia Brown was like my thing. Nancy Drew, Sherlock Holmes, any mystery I could get my hands on. And of course, that just kept kind of being the theme in my life. I studied journalism as, an undergrad, and part of that was because I wanted to learn how to interview people, ask them questions, learn about their lives, kind of allow people to tell their stories. And then I became a librarian in the same vein because I wanted to know how to do the research and wanted to teach other people how to do that research. I'm all about freedom of information and, people being able to have access to materials and all those sorts of things. So I think it all just kind of came together in my life. And when I really, really started to get into researching true crime was after I became a librarian. I was now aware of all of these resources, and I had become a mom during that time, and I had seen the stories about JonBenet Ramsey being murdered in her own home, and I couldn't imagine being that family. Like, I just was devastated by that story. I couldn't imagine not knowing what happened to her. It was horrifying to me. And so, I think having children really brought that to the surface for me. And I am, I was really, really interested in doing that type of research. I didn't know where to go, like what databases could I look at back in the 2000s. I wasn't sure, but I happened to one day be watching a show called The Forgotten, and it was a story about a group of people that came together to work together, as we do today, to try to find missing people and or identify unidentified people. And at the end of that show, it just so happened that they flashed the website of NamUs. So they said, if you're interested in doing this kind of work, you can, check out the NamUs database. And so I was like, my dream came true. Like, I remember watching the show and saying, like, I want to do this. This is what I want to do. And then at the end of the show, it's basically telling me, oh, okay, and this is how you do it. Which was like, I was so happy. I ran to the computer. I was able to. I was using dial up in the 2000s to do some of this stuff. But I ran to the computer and I looked up the website and I started utilizing it. So at the time, I was using the Doe Network, I was using NamUs, and I was using Web Sleuths to kind of make comparisons between missing and unidentified people. And I continued to do that all the way up until 2020 when I started TrueCrime PI. I had just moved to Georgia, stumbled across a case of an unidentified woman who was found in 1984 in Cobb County, Georgia. And something about her caught my attention. I wrote a blog post about it, and I just could not forget her. And I thought I need to do something more. And so I started writing episode 1 of her story, which then, as I dug in deeper, turned into a 7-part series about what we knew about her. And my goal was just basically to amplify her story, to get it out there. It had been 36 years since she was found, and they still didn't know who she was. And I couldn't figure out why. And I had all these questions. And so I took 7 episodes to kind of dig into that and find out why she was still unidentified and what I could do to help change that.
That's awesome. It's so interesting learning everyone's start into true crime. It made, like, when you were talking about the like with the milk, I was thinking about like my start to it, and yes, it was like podcasts and such, but even before then, like the stranger danger thing, because I totally forgot this had happened, but I remember it was happening in my town. Granted, like it didn't. There would be like, oh, the white van, like someone saw a white van, and it was like the classic lore of like, oh, like, do you want to see puppies or whatever it was, or candy? And the girl who had lived behind me at my old house, it happened to her, and she was okay. But it was just like, thinking about it now, like, you never really realize how close to home it can like hit sometimes. And And yeah, so when you were talking about like your starting, made me think of that.
Mhm.
But I think what's so interesting about the unidentified is that it's almost like researching a missing persons case, but like backwards in a way.
Mhm.
Because you have a lot less to go off of and you kind of have to make more inferences. Are there some tips and tricks that you have for when you're researching these sorts of cases?
So I think, I used to, when I was teaching, and I was a librarian at the university and I was teaching students how to do research, I would say that you have to develop your own style and there is no right or wrong way to do it. However, there are some tips that I can discuss with you or share with you. And that would be, you really have to pay attention to the details. So if you're going to try to be making matches, you need to pay attention to the location, the date the body was discovered, the PMI, or the time frame of which they were estimated to have been killed
Hmm.
or to have died. Um, you have to take those into consideration because you can go down a rabbit hole and not even realize that the person that you are trying to match, the missing person that you are trying to match this unidentified person, did not go missing until after this unidentified person was found. It's really easy to kind of get caught in that trap. So you're looking at you might be looking at a sketch and comparing it and you're like, wow, that really looks, and oh, the location's good, they're close together and that seems like that could be possible. And then you realize after you spend all this time that this person could not possibly be a match based on the timing. And I
Hmm.
think that that's the hard part sometimes. So you have to keep track of that. I always, what I like to do is I will open up. I use my dashboard in NamUs a lot, so I have a list of cases that are missing, cases that are unidentified, people. I keep them so they're saved, and then I will open up, the missing in one window, the unidentified in another, so that I can just have two screens up, two windows open, and I'm doing comparisons right next to each other. Um, so that's a tip. We created at Uncovered a really nice printable form where you can download it and you can do those comparisons on paper. I personally like to print my stuff out and put them next to each other. I like rating things. Some people are really use spreadsheets like in a way I could never dream of doing. So I think, it really depends on what you prefer to do. But, I like looking, one of the things I really like is to be able to look at NamUs. If I see a case, I look it up on the Doe Network because the Doe Network will oftentimes tell you if there's DNA available. And if there are, if they have fingerprints available, dentals available, those sorts of things are listed sometimes on the Doe Network, and you can't necessarily see that in NamUs. So I like to know that, especially if I'm going to be submitting a match. And I like that you can look at comparisons that have already been made. So that's a really important piece. Some people don't realize you can do that because they don't create an account in
Yeah.
NamUs.
Hmm.
But if you create an account in NamUs, you can see the comparisons that have already been made. So I've seen people go through the whole process and be like, I know this is a great match. And then someone will pop up and be like, no, that's already been, that
Mhm.
comparison has already been ruled out. And it's
Yeah.
so deflating when that happens. So I always try to remind people to make sure you log in to NamUs, create an account, log in, and then go ahead and start making sure you double check those comparisons before you want to submit a match.
And I think
Yeah.
that's the big thing that is, I guess, the negative in all of those systems. None of they do better now than they ever have, but they don't mesh with each other. And the same with law enforcement to NamUs to the Doe network. It seems like there should be with all the technology that we have, there should be a centralized system that pulls all that information, because I've went through and looked and been like, okay, I'm going to start researching this case. And then I start researching and I realized that, the person was found, or, came back home or whatever a year later, or, whatever scenario or situation. I'm like, that's just terrible that there's nothing that's
Mhm.
there yet to connect all of that stuff together to give us a one centralized database.
That is so true, Robert. And I am hoping that over the next, I would like to say 5 years, but over the next 10 years, we can get there, because I think we've come a long way. Let's say we have definitely come a long way, but we are to the point now where we need to, number one, have laws in every state that require law enforcement to enter cases into NamUs. So not only do we not have one centralized database like you were talking about, but we don't have every case in NamUs. That's the government website. We should have every case in that database, and we don't. So I think there's 13 states that require that law enforcement enter their cases in. There's nobody knocking on their door saying, are you entering your cases? And did you enter all of your cases? And did you go back through your paper files and enter those? There's nobody doing that. And so therefore, we really don't know, even those states that are required, is every case in there? We really don't know the answer to that question.
Well, and it's only required since they said it was required.
Right.
It's nothing. It's no historical data unless they just have the people and the time and the effort to go back to make that happen.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And even to tack on top of that too, like I know from Dana and I both working at Uncovered together, just looking at different counties and jurisdictions and their websites. And you're lucky if you can find like a cold case section on their website that displays that information. Not every county does. I'm fairly certain that my county doesn't even do that. And that even makes it harder, because if you wanted to even let the public try and input this information to NamUs or some other database, they can't, because they don't even have it available on like a local level.
Mhm.
So it makes it
That
tough.
That's one thing I can say about Cobb County is they're very good. They're probably one of the best ones in making sure that information is there. And I think they have historical information backwards. I mean, I'm almost positive they got all their historical database up to date compared to everybody else anyway.
Yeah. I've also seen too. Oh, go ahead, Dina.
Oh, no, I was going to say I love to hear that, when you know of a department who actually has gone through put the effort into doing that work. I just wanted to piggyback off of that to answer your question about the databases really, and say, we don't have all of the missing in NamUs. We don't have all of the unidentified in NamUs. And the unidentified is even, I think, harder, because unidentified bodies are held in different areas. So in some states, in some cities, in some towns, the hospital has the unidentified bodies. Some places it's the ME's office. Sometimes it's, as sad as it sounds, an evidence room at a law enforcement office. It's crazy. So being able to tally those numbers is even harder, I think, than even missing people. And in Oregon, they did something that I think is brilliant, and I would love to see every state do. And I know this would require funding, but what they did in Oregon was the medical examiner came in and they were building a new facility, and she made sure that the facility was large enough to house the number of unidentified bodies in her state. And so she had done an inventory before they built, and then she went and she got every single recorded unidentified body remains and moved those all into her facility. So now they always will come to her facility. So now they're centralized. They're all there. There's no question on, is there a body somewhere that we're not aware of, or is that body at the morgue, or is it at the ME's office? That happens in other states. And so to me, I mean, I understand why, but it's when you talk about it, these are people, you know what I mean? And it's very hard for me to justify this kind of process and the way we do things, and how it just continues, where it doesn't, it's not a priority like that. freaks me out, to be honest. Like, I just don't understand why we don't make these things a priority. I understand money comes in, but there's pre-planning. It could take years, but at least somebody's talking and thinking about it. But that's not even happening. So I think that that's the thing that, that really gets me is aside from the databases, we have these systems, just at the local levels that don't work, you know what I mean? And haven't worked for years.
Yeah, and even too, it's interesting because in some cases, even just going back to trying to make matches, like you're lucky if that individual was even reported missing.
Mhm.
So, and in that case, you have even less to work off of. Although I do think it's interesting though, because on Facebook and such, like I've seen there's lots of different pages for like unidentifieds, and every now and again, you'll see basically posts probably that came from NamUs and that sort of thing, where it's like, can you identify this person? And I would not be surprised if that has helped identify people in the past. But on the other hand, how awful is it to like find someone that you know in that state, in that way, just online?
Mhm.
Like that could be incredibly jarring. And I think too, it's one of those things where the unidentified kind of get forgotten about because it's easier to champion a murdered victim or a missing person because they have names and you could
Mhm.
attach it to something or who they were. But with unidentified, you don't like it's a gamble. You have no idea what they liked, who they were, their favorite color, none of that. So it
Right.
makes it, I think, harder. I mean, it's a unique challenge. It's a great challenge, but it's just so much more different.
I think in the last, 5 to 10 years, we've gotten, I don't want to say into the habit of over reporting people missing, but I think it's more prevalent now that someone, when they go missing for a certain amount of time, they're reported. But back in, the 90s and the 80s, if you were 14 years old and you went missing, the police wouldn't even think about talking to anybody because they just ran away. They didn't want to be here, so they just ran away.
Yeah.
So it was such commonplace to just pawn that off on an easier route of they just left, as opposed to actually investigating and what happened. And then you didn't have the databases like you do now, so those people are just continue to remain unidentified.
Yes. And, I think often we don't remember that an unidentified person, whether reported or not, is often a missing person or someone whose family lost track of them. And so I think, when we talk about unidentified people, we're really talking about solving a missing person case. And, for the most part, I mean, we when Lexi, you said not everyone is reported missing. That's true, but most of the time, a family member knows about this missing person
Hmm.
or is missing this person, but they
Yeah.
may not have been officially reported, or they thought they reported them missing, or that sort of thing. So I think that it's really important to remember that unidentified people are, for the most part, a missing person, and so we are moving a missing person case forward when we identify an unidentified person.
Yeah. And in some cases too, I've seen where it almost kind of like checks all the boxes where it starts off as an unidentified, and then you find out that they were missing, and then their cause of death was homicide. And so it kind of goes through almost all of the phases. And
Mhm.
yet, so there's been so many cases where it's like, oh, it's great that this person's identified, but now we have to figure out how they died, who killed them, and what happened there. So it's like a whole new section of the investigation.
I agree. I think it is a process with an unidentified person. So if oftentimes it is a homicide. If we're talking about Cobb County Jane Doe, we don't know who she is. We don't know, you know, where, like, who murdered her, but we know she was murdered. So we know that it was a homicide. There's no question about that. So when we get her name, then we'll have her name, and then the investigation starts over because now we know this was a homicide, and so now we can push forward. I've talked to a lot of law enforcement, and they will say over and over again, and it makes total sense, but sometimes it's not at the top of our minds. But once they have a name, then you can start doing victimology. Then you can find out where they were, what they were doing, who they hung out with. And then you can start connecting the dots. It's very difficult to connect dots when you don't know who this unidentified person is.
Do you know if the Jane Doe, her information has been entered into a DNA database?
Yes. So Cobb County Jane Doe's DNA was taken or the profile was created, I believe, in 2011 initially. And then again, I would say, I'm guessing, I don't know the exact year, but in 21, 22, they did another profile, created a SNP, and they have done genetic genealogy to find a cousin. So they have located a cousin. We are just waiting for confirmation. We're waiting for an announcement. I don't know if that announcement is delayed because I had pushed for, I had introduced this case to Amy Hutzel. She's part of the SACI task force and part of the task force that actually tries to match unidentified or unsolved Georgia homicides with Samuel Little confessions. And so that whole process was happening simultaneously. COVID hit, unfortunately, so I think that delayed the whole kind of review process or reexamination. But I know it's still happening because I reach out to her periodically. And the last time I talked to her, I said, do you have any news on the case? And she said, let me check and see what I'm allowed to release. And so I know we're just kind of like, we're in this waiting period, which if this type of research or this type of work doesn't teach you patience, nothing will, because it is.
That's so true.
So slow. Yeah. I mean, like, it's just so, I mean, even like, pulling all the pieces together is difficult, and then finding the right people and getting in touch with the right people and getting the answers that you need. And then trying to convince others to, maybe, fund her DNA or whatever it is, whatever you're doing in a case. It just takes a long time. It's not quick and by any means. And so I have learned patience through this case. I have learned just to sit back and say, they're working on it, and have faith. It's going to happen. And I believe she should be identified this year. So it will be 40 years since she was discovered.
Yep.
And it will be 4 years since I started talking about her case, since I started the podcast.
A lot of people don't understand because they think, oh, I put my stuff into Ancestry and I got my results back in 5 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever. Mm-hmm. Why can't you get it back faster? They don't understand the actual process that it has to go through to get it to where it is. I mean, just finding a cousin is a big thing, but then you have to go backwards and still continue to figure out if that person is actually missing, or there's so much into it.
Yes. And what I love about that is that, a lot of people don't understand the idea of genetic genealogy being a combination of, DNA, science, and research. Just good old fashioned, genealogy, research, good old fashioned detective work. Like, all of that comes together to, really kind of either nail a suspect or to, identify a person.
So in that, I guess I have two questions to go off of that. Do you know what the cost is for the police department to do the genetic testing on, say, a Jane Doe or a John Doe?
I do not know if there's a standard cost. I have seen costs associated with it. So, I mean, if you look at, DNA Solves, they charge, I think is it 5,000 or 7,000 to do all. I think that involves all of it, the profiling, the genetic genealogy. I've seen other people who have said, we can do this work for 3,500. I don't know what that work is in particular. I don't know if they're doing all of it, if there's separate lab costs. So I don't know the exact cost. I know that, I'm grateful that the SACI task force is because they believe that her death was a sexual assault. They were able to put money towards her testing. And so I think that that is awesome when that can happen. And I think that they do that across this country a lot. So they'll provide money to, law enforcement if it is a sexual assault or a case that looks like that is what happened. So that's wonderful. I think there's multiple ways to get funding. I think I don't know that. I think it's so easy to say we just don't have the money, or is it that we don't have the resources or the time to go through the cold case, to look at it, to move it forward to the point where we could ask for the money to then have the testing done. I think it's bigger than just money. Yeah.
Yeah. And some states too, like I could speak for New York, like they don't make it easy. There's a lot of like red tape between like the private labs and the state labs and what you can do and where you can do it. And like that alone, you can get really tied up in just like the politics of that. And so you're not able to push a case forward because there's so much other things happening.
And I think what happens a lot of times, especially like I know in Georgia, there's so many competing organizations. You've got a county sheriff, you've got the city that it possibly happened in, then you've got the state level stuff, and they're all fighting for different funding, and they don't understand how to utilize the funding because it's so territorial. They don't want other people in their business and things like that. So things do not happen because of lack of knowledge of the best way to go about it, and they don't want to dig into it, or they don't have the people to dig into it to get the funding. So therefore, a small little police force of 10 or 15 people aren't going to have the knowledge and ability or the amount of people to look at a case from 1984 or 1985 because they're dealing with stuff that's going on today.
Right. And that is the biggest problem. I think if we had designated cold case units across this country, or even regional cold case units, I mean, just a system for cold case units that we could employ in every state. And, it's sad because I think there's citizens who have skills that may be able to join that unit. There are retired detectives, retired, law enforcement who may be able to and interested. And I know many who are interested. I just think the red tape gets in the way sometimes, and we can't get out of our own way to kind of solve these problems. But if we could, then we wouldn't have that problem. And, I learned from my friend Detective John Dawes when he was helping me, kind of share what he knew about the Cobb County case. He talked about how, warm cases or hot cases or current cases, however you want to describe them, they happen every day. And so that all the good meaning, all the I wish I had time for, to take a look at that case file, or I'm going to leave this right here on my desk and I will get to it. That goes out the window whenever the phone's ringing and you're being called to a scene, and, all those things are happening. And so having a designated cold case unit like they did have in Cobb County, and John Dawes was the head of that, from, I think it was 2014 through 2019. When they had that, they weren't getting called anywhere else. They were seriously just looking at cold cases all day, every day, figuring out who they were going to interview, going to do those interviews, figuring out where the evidence was, deciding if it could be tested, getting it to the point, where it was profiled, whatever that was effective. They solved 11 cold cases in that unit in 5 years.
Yep.
Which I think that's now become 12 because Deborah Lynn Randall's case came out of that cold case unit, and it was just recently solved.
That was the one that the neighbor had killed her, right? That they found out. Yep.
Yeah. So I think that, that is something that is super important. That is something that I would like to see happen, where people really, not just the Homicide Victims Family Rights Act happening, but let's designate cold case units who can, have the resources to look at these cold cases.
I know for Georgia, the Coleman-Baker Act was enacted last year. I guess this is truly the first year. 2024 will be the first calendar year that it's in place. So I'm interested to see how that's going to affect cold cases in Georgia with that money that's set aside for that. So I know there's a little bit of red tape, and a lot of these little municipalities probably don't even know about it. So I think it's going to come back on people that are involved with cold cases and things like that outside of law enforcement requesting the funds to be attributed to that person before it happens. But so I'll be interested to see how that comes to fruition this year.
Yeah. And
Yes.
even speaking of, I know the Homicide Victims Family Rights Act, which I think was signed into law by President Biden in 2022. So theoretically, this might now be its like second full year. And I feel like families are just starting to learn about it. I would not be surprised if law enforcement, it doesn't, from what I can tell, I don't know if a lot of agencies have protocol in place to kind of handle how they want to use this act and what it can actually do for cases. But I think what's really cool about it is that by just getting the word out there that it is an option, hopefully families can actually lean on it, and we'll start to see some resolutions from, families being like, well, what about this act? And, can we kind of do a reinvestigation of everything? Because I would not be surprised, and I don't think this is an original idea by any means, but a lot of these cases can be solved if we just kind of bring it to today's standards for one reason or another.
Yes. Yeah. Apply to the science and solve them. Yeah.
Yeah. The moment they add DNA into a case from in the 80s and early 90s, it should open up so many doors, even if it's just being able to identify the person, to get a actual history and look at who that person was and what could have happened to them, because that explains a lot of things. I mean, it's just like the one we were just talking about in Cobb County, where they identified the neighbor. He committed, I think he committed suicide 2 years after he committed the murder, but everyone knew something was wrong. And had they known that was her back then, they would have solved that case, 20 years ago.
Yeah. And I think too, a lot of it has to do with like just giving people a chance to, like, fresh eyes on something, like, what could be normal to me, maybe not like abnormal to somebody else, and vice versa. And all those little things, like just looking at the patterns of it, because I think more often than not, the likely name of the perpetrator, if it's like a murdered case at least, or even a missing case, could be, is already in that case file. It's just, why were they ruled out, or, what was missing, or why couldn't you attach them to the case? And just giving it a second look at it could really kind of put the pieces together.
Yeah, I actually am going to be doing a podcast episode with Detective Dawes about that case. And in that case, the name wasn't in the case file. So you are correct. I mean, we've heard this a million times, like just in the first 10 pages of the case file, normally you find your perpetrator. And in that case, so I found it interesting when we had our conversation about it, that person's name was not. So that person wasn't even on their radar at all. And to, the type of murder that was, to not have that, it would have been, it was, I think, a red flag to many who are investigating it. Like, where did this person go? There's nothing in CODIS. There's nothing to match this person. Like, who, where did he go? He committed a crime that was so heinous. Would he not be doing it again and again? And they couldn't figure out why. Well, this is why, because he committed suicide 2 years later. So, he was I don't know his situation. I'm glad that he was no longer on the street, able to do those things. I'm not saying I'm happy he committed suicide, but I am glad that he was no longer able to do that, because her story is horribly sad and unsolved for so many years. And what a wonderful thing to have it solved, though. Even for Detective Dawes, he told us the story, Lexi, when he spoke with us on Uncovered, that he personally flew DNA to Utah And that was her DNA. That was the DNA from that case. So he personally flew it to Utah for testing because he was not going to let it out of his sight, because he just was so determined to have that case be solved. And he retired in 2019, and the case was solved in 2023, because then again, it takes long to do all of these things. And so so he had to wait another 4 or 5 years for that to happen, and for the solve to be made. But what a wonderful thing, to know that we no longer have to wonder who killed her. We no longer have to wonder if there's still that person still somewhere perpetrating those types of crime.
And he hasn't, since he retired, they haven't really replaced him, have they not? I don't think.
No, they haven't really. So, this is the problem with cold case units that are established in DA's offices, because the DAs change, and the priority of those people coming in and out of the office changes. And so those departments will sometimes get eliminated or downsized. And so they never built it up to the same caliber that he had it for those 5 years. And that's sad to me, because when something's working, I think people should take a look at it and see how it can be salvaged. To think that, I don't know the number of cold cases in Cobb County or even in the surrounding Atlanta area. I know there's a lot of them. I don't know the exact number, but to think that if you could solve 11 every 5 years or 12 every 5 years, that's making a dent. I mean, that's a great thing. And I think, with DNA, with the improvements in the speed of processing DNA, even though we still feel like it takes a long time, it's still better than it was. Genetic genealogy really didn't come to be until 2018. And so, with all the advancements that have happened there, I just feel like it would be much faster now. Even I bet you could solve more than 11 in 5 years. And so, I mean, that's the heartbreaking part about it is that it's hard to drive those ideas home. It's hard to make people understand that resources should be allotted for these things. It seems like it goes to everything else but. And to me, that's heartbreaking, because families are just waiting for answers for years and years and years, and carrying the unbearable burden of not knowing for far too long.
Well, and it's one of those things that I've said, it's when a family member can fight and continue the fight, it's when they're able to get answers. It's, it takes a toll on the family. And at some point in time, if it hasn't destroyed their life completely and they're able to continue to fight, they finally get answers. But, at some point in time, a lot of people just throw their hands up because they fought so hard and have just not gotten past anything to even get a slim chance or a slim answer. So it's tough.
Yeah. I have a question for you, though, from the wrongful conviction side and DNA testing. So, I mean, obviously, these are the things that a lot of wrongful convictions it could be rectified with DNA testing. So my question to you is that happening more? Are we seeing more of that? Like, how is genetic genealogy or DNA profiling, all those sorts of things playing into the resolution of wrongful convictions?
So I think when there is new evidence into a case, that's how it can be reopened, as it has to be true new evidence. If there is DNA that was never tested, it's usually either requested. If it's requested, then that's what is pushing for some of those wrongful conviction turnovers. And that's what you've seen more lately is that they've been turned over because of DNA evidence. It's not that someone else just appeared and said I did it and people are getting out. It's typically almost every wrongful conviction that I've looked at over the last 3 or 4 years has for the most part has been due to new evidence of DNA being tested and attributed to someone else that is either in jail or already convicted of another crime, or something else that brings it up.
Yeah, I mean, I have to, I am having done the research trying to match missing and unidentified people in, the 2000s all the way up through 2018 when genetic genealogy changed everything. Um, I would say, I remember maybe 10 people being identified during those years, because it's hard to identify people just from a sketch or, what look they look alike, they were near the same place. I mean, it was harder for us to do that. The databases have gotten better. We have more ability to make comparisons because we can see more missing people, more unidentified people, and we can try to make those matches. But the genetic genealogy was a complete game changer in that, we have one agency last year who solved almost 150 cases. We have an agency that over the past, I don't know how many years, solved 300 cases. So, as I would love to know the total number of all unidentified people identified by genetic genealogy since 2018, just because it would be a fun fact for me. But I think that this is a game changer. It's going to continue to get better, and we'll be making more identifications every year, and that's exciting to me because with the numbers that we're looking at in cold cases and the numbers that we're looking at in the number of unidentified, which is just an estimate, as I said, solving these cases is, if we can start generating good numbers here, we're going to be dwindling those numbers, dwindling the number of unidentifieds. And that is something I've been waiting for years. So I am super, excited about the work that all of the organizations that are doing, these labs are doing, to work with law enforcement to get these people identified.
And I think that's the key, is that as technology keeps advancing, obviously we'll have less unidentified individuals because the technology is already there, that when remains are found, they're able to test those a lot quicker. And because it is at the forefront, that stuff is happening, that DNA testing is happening right away, as opposed to, someone that was found in the 80s or 70s that we're just now getting pulled back up to be able to look at that information. And,
Right.
and that's one of the things, when we were talking just a minute ago about wrongful convictions, I think that's probably a detriment for, an individual in the 80s, 70s, 80s, or early 90s that was convicted of a crime because DNA wasn't handled properly. Some cases were. There's some amazing, and when I hear that case from 1988 that, they had tissue, they had blood, they had fingernail clippings, and all of that stuff was saved and was still, not degraded. And they did all of that back then to take care of all that stuff. But then you hear other cases that they don't have anything, that they destroyed every bit of evidence because they lost it or it got wet in a flooded room or something like that. It's unfortunate that there probably are a lot of people that could be overturned because of that, but they don't have that because it was never properly taken care of.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it too, is just even in the beginning stages of it, making sure that the investigation is done properly. Because half the time, you're lucky if you have, the fingernail clippings, the blood samples, all these things. Because if not, that makes, solving the case so much harder, especially with what's available today.
Yes, I mean, I am impressed sometimes by the work that was done before they knew that they would actually have access to DNA testing. What they saved, how they packaged it, how they cataloged it, how they kept it. And then, like you said, Robert, there's others, like even in Cobb County, Jane Doe's case, they lost evidence. And so they can't test her clothing to see if the DNA on her clothing matches a suspect, whether that would be Samuel Little or whether it wouldn't be. But we can't rule him in or rule him out based on that evidence because we don't have it. And so, it is very frustrating when that happens. I storage was an issue. It became an issue over the years. Cataloging things, organizing things. I mean, I've heard nightmares about evidence rooms that, and as a librarian, it freaks me out that there's no like system, but that they were just in envelopes and piled on top and they fell behind cabinets. And then years later, when they're moving out of that building or they move a cabinet, they find it and they're like, oh, look, there's the evidence. And I mean, I'm not pointing fingers and criticizing. There just wasn't a system. There wasn't, we've all evolved. I mean, going from what you were talking about earlier about, having to wait to report a missing person for, whatever number, a week, 72 hours, 48 hours, whatever the department decided was good for them, or worked for them, because they didn't want to fill out paperwork, when someone may return, or declaring someone a runaway and that hindering the investigation into their case. All of those sorts of things, we've come a long way. We understand the importance of the first 48 hours. We don't behave that way anymore. Law enforcement, for the most part, is, gets on it. And one of the things that I have thoroughly discussed that I've come to realize is if you have a missing person and the law enforcement comes to the scene to investigate a missing person, they take a missing person report, that case should be treated like a homicide. There should be an investigation of the area. There should be whatever it is. Everything should be treated as if it's a homicide, and you should have to prove that it wasn't a homicide. Not the reverse, because what happens is if you have a missing person, they come in, what was he wearing? What was this? What was that? Just like the basics, no real looking into things, no, like inspecting homes, not, looking for anything out of the ordinary, that sort of thing. You go to the police department and you report the person missing. They haven't seen the area, they've seen nothing. And so then 2 days later, 3 days later, this becomes a homicide investigation. And where is all that initial evidence? It has not been collected. So did they lose the opportunity to collect it? Possibly. Was the car brought home, returned to the family, and now it's contaminated? Or, it wasn't fingerprinted, it wasn't DNA. So I think, and we've seen things like, we've seen where a law enforcement has made assumptions about a scene or, for instance, a suicide, and that gets passed off to the medical examiner. And then later it is determined, wait a minute, this doesn't look like a suicide. This looks like a potential homicide. Those aren't good things. So if we just start with everything's a homicide, I think we're, ahead of the game instead of behind the 8 ball. So
yeah, I think
my thought.
They have to look at it as a worst case scenario and go backwards and hope for the best, but look at it as the worst. And I don't think they do that. And I think it comes down to the size of the department, the size of the town. When you look at growth, you look at Cobb County, from 1984 to now, it's nobody would recognize, it's not even close to being the same, but some of the little smaller towns in Georgia, like Walker County, for instance, is so small that those things happen, that they're going to write it off as being the quickest, easiest way. And, exactly. I think in today's age and time that we're at, that no one disappears on their own without a trace, if that makes sense.
Yes.
When all of a sudden somebody goes missing and their bank accounts aren't accessed, their cell phone's not used, there's no social media track, there's nothing. When it just goes, there's nobody that can do that. I don't care. It's somebody that has no money, somebody that has all the money in the world, they're just not going to be able to just disappear and stop. There's going to be some trace in today's world. In the 70s and 80s, it was a lot easier to go missing on your own if you just wanted to disappear, because you didn't have a GPS tracker with you everywhere you went.
Right.
But between that and bank accounts and, somebody that was fighting to live day to day and, living paycheck to paycheck isn't going to be able just to disappear off the grid today without, having and leaving money in their accounts, oh yeah, they have $1,000 in their account that hasn't been touched, and there's something wrong there.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure.
So, it's that's the biggest thing is we have to make sure families are pushing for it, that when someone does go missing, they have to be the ones. If the police aren't taking it serious, they have to be the ones organizing Facebook. They have to be the one organizing flyers and doing everything they can to get it into the forefront and making sure the right people know.
Yeah, and I think some of that too is like it's hard to know what's the right thing to do right out the gate because you're probably being advised by police, don't share this detail, don't share that detail, and kind of having to figure out what should really be kept close to the vest and what can be made public, because I think there is a fine line between that. And even still, that's a lot of mental work for the families to have to go through
Mhm.
because they're already grieving essentially their missing loved one, and now to have to kind of take on a whole other role on top of their daily life of having a job, maybe being a parent or whatever it is, that they now have to go ahead and kind of take on an advocacy cap on top of it is a lot. And I think a lot of people learn through doing, especially in the advocacy space. Like people are kind of, you have to just do it and get in it to see what works, what doesn't. But I think Facebook and such has made it a lot easier, but it doesn't mean it's any less daunting.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So, Dana, what do you have coming up over the next few weeks?
So I am going to be recording with Detective Dawes about the Deborah Lynn Randall case. I am working on an unidentified case from Florida. It's from 1986, and it was a man who was an unidentified man was riding a bicycle and got hit by a car and has remained unidentified for all of these years. So I'm covering that case to try to bring some attention to it. I don't think it's as far as I'm concerned, I stumbled upon it and I've never seen it anywhere else other than just in the databases. So I wanted to try to tell the story. So I FOIA'd the documents and have a little bit more information to share than what has been shared. And so I'm hoping to kind of bring some exposure to his case.
That's awesome.
And then Lexi and I and Andrea are working on a YouTube series on the Dawn Pasella case. And it's going to be called Seeking Justice. And we're hoping to release to hold our first live in mid-February. So we're working diligently on that. We're going to be bringing in Dawn's family, a close friend of hers, to tell us about who Dawn was as a person. And then we are also going to bring in her advocate, get the background on, how she kind of got involved in the situation she was in and why that happened. And then we're going to bring in Detective Dawes and a lawyer who is working on the case to discuss certain aspects of the case. So every week we'll have a different guest, and we're excited. It should be interesting. And we really just hope we want more people to learn about her case. And we also would like, to have people kind of become aware of, her story and how it has affected her family over the past, going to be 12 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we are happy to do that and excited to do that, and really just we're hoping that some exposure that we provide will, invite others to cover her case. And it'll just be one of those and so on and so on and so on things. And so, yeah, we're looking forward to that.
Yeah.
We're excited. We're looking forward to that as well for y'all.
Yes.
And now we got quiet. Are you going to CrimeCon?
Yes.
This year? Okay.
Yes, I am.
And then,
I'm excited to do that. I don't know. I would like to go to the one in Denver. Why can't I think of it? Yeah, I'd like to go to that one. And the what's it called? Arkansas.
with LaDonna, the one in Northwest
Yeah.
Arkansas. I
Yeah.
know for sure. I booked a plane trip to Denver, so I'll be going to Denver. I will be at CrimeCon, and I'll be there with LaDonna as well. I think I'm doing a
Good.
panel with LaDonna. I'm not sure.
Oh, cool.
So,
That's awesome.
yep. So we're excited. But thank you very much for being on. I know that we just kind of threw this together, and we enjoy talking with you, and we'll definitely have you guys back with just before hopefully y'all get started on your stuff to I think mid-February you said to get started. So,
Yeah.
so hopefully we'll have you back, and then I think we're going to try to cover a portion of that case as well at some point in time, to get a little bit more out there. And then we got a lot coming up, and I know you do too. So good.
Yes. Unfortunately, there is no, shortage of cases to talk about. And so although I enjoy these conversations and I'm more than happy to talk, I will look forward to the day where we don't have so much to talk about.
Yes,
Yeah.
I want it to be where we're only talking about old cases that are just almost impossible to solve, as opposed to things that are happening in our lifetime.
Yes.
Hopefully it's stuff that we can get past that. Awesome.
Well, thank you, Dana.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everyone for joining us this week. We appreciate you, and we look forward to talking to you guys next week. We will have a new episode coming at you with me and Lexi. Thank you. Before you go, we want to remind you to stay connected with us. Follow us on all our social media platforms to keep up with the latest updates, behind-the-scenes content, and more. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, all at The Broken System Podcast. And if you want to support the show and get access to exclusive content, consider becoming a patron on our Patreon page. Your support helps us to keep the podcast going and growing. Visit patreon.com, The Broken System Podcast, to join our community. Thank you for being a part of the Broken System Podcast family. We'll be back with more exciting episodes in the new year. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and keep breaking the system.